Okay, I started at 1 o'clock and I left 3 minutes for people to turn up, but I think I might be on my own for this one. It's not the end of the world. Just need to shut down on my social media and then fire up the slideshow. And interesting question about how do you manage to... Yes, okay, let's do that. So yeah, I think that's probably the best I can hope for. Yeah, so this is another talk for Delivering the Impossible. I'm just keeping an eye on my coffee there. Just I want to ruin my talk with overflowing coffee. Yeah, so this is the second of my talks about Delivering the Impossible, my book. And what I've realized is that I really struggle with overarching form and structure. See, I'm waving my hands already. If I don't talk about it, if I try and write about it, I find it very difficult. If I talk about it, I find it much easier. So this is essentially for me to think through this idea of being between two streams, which I think in some ways is new. It's kind of related to the innovator's dilemma and crossing that chasm. I can't remember the chap who talked about that, but anyway, let's start at the very beginning. Let's start with a car. So this is a Toyota from the 1980s. And in the 1980s, after the energy crisis, so we're kind of going back, there was an energy crisis in the 70s. The result of that meant fuel was expensive. So people got more interested in cars that were better at fuel consumption. And the Japanese emerged as being good at making cars that were better at fuel consumption and generally good at making cars, making cars that were reliable. And they started to basically defeat their competition in America. And that resulted in people starting to go and look at how Toyota did things, started to ask kind of, well, how come Toyota is so good at making cars? What are they doing that's different from what we're doing? And a lot of what they're doing is outlined in a book by this chap called Taiichi Ohno, who talks about the Toyota production system. So Toyota what got into the car business in the 1930s. And one of the things that they realized when they started to get into the car business was that they couldn't do it. They went over to, I think, Indiana and looked at the factories of the Ford Motor Company in Indiana and saw this idea of mass production. They had production lines, but they were making enormous numbers of cars, as many cars as they could, and realized that this probably wouldn't work for Japan for two reasons. One was that the economy in Japan was extremely cyclical. They knew that sometimes there were boom years where people had money and they could buy things like newfangled things like cars. And then at other times, there were bust phases in the economy where people didn't have much money. The other thing that they understood was that the Japanese market at the time was tiny, so they wouldn't be able to just make as many cars as they possibly could, as they were doing in America, as Ford were doing in America. So they put together a way of manufacturing cars, which they've essentially honed over the past 90 years, because it is 90 years since they started making cars. They've put together a method, and there are some crucial aspects of that method that are kind of different from the way that cars are made in America. One of those aspects is that the Japanese way of making cars, especially the way that's described by Taiichi Ohno, is very much focused on demand. So it's focused on manufacturing a car for which there's an identified demand. And the way that I understand it, the way that the Toyota production system is set up is that kind of information basically flows through the system so that each car that's being made is for a specific order. That's certainly the way that it's set up to work in Japan. And this kind of demand is known as pull. This kind of this kind of force that is kind of extracting cars almost from the factory is known as pull. The other thing that became obvious, or kind of has been kind of talked about with regard to Toyota, is this idea of something called a value stream. So the idea is that each of the processes that a car goes through before it is ready to be delivered, each of those processes adds value. And so one of the ways that Toyota got better and better and better at manufacturing cars was to focus on the processes that add value and reducing the time between those processes so that you had a smooth flow of the item, the car that is getting doors added to it and paint put on it and Lord knows what. So you had a smooth flow of all these different value steps to a final delivery of this thing that is valuable to somebody who actually wants it. Now, this is a way of thinking about making a product. And it is one that gets discussed quite a lot when people talk about doing software development. But there are some serious problems with using this kind of idea of thinking about developing software products. And that is because this is an existing process for something that is an existing product. So cars have been around for 90 years, for nearly 100 years now. And so the process for making them is to a large degree understood. And this is the difference between, or this is what I suggest is the difference between the process, the kind of value stream that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about developing new software products, and the value stream that we have for cars. Now, this is a slide that I should have moved on to, and I haven't, which is basically that there's this idea in the discussions of Taiichi Ohno about the Toyota value stream, about the idea of waste, that kind of each of the stages of waiting along this process is waste. I'm not going to cover that right now. This is the other thing that I was just talking about, which is pull. The process of pulling, essentially imagining that products are being pulled out of the factory by customer desire. Now, this is the thing that I really want to say about the value streams. That in the manufacture of existing products, we have this one value stream, so things are moving down this value stream, value is getting added to them, and then at the end there is a customer who is pulling them, who's like you're delivering value to that customer. The difficulty when we're making new products, and that's what most software development projects are, they're the development of new products. The difficulty when we're developing new products is that there are actually two value streams. I've described these as, there's a weird value stream, you see the one there with the unicorn, and then there's one that doesn't exist. So the weird value stream is the idea of the product. And that's come from somewhere, and we don't really know, almost always when we're working on a project, we don't really know where that idea has come from. And then the one that doesn't exist, the value stream that doesn't exist, is we need to have something that is like the value stream that Toyota has for its cars, but we don't have that yet, because part of the reason why is we don't have our idea of what the car is, we don't know what the product is, and so we don't know what the the value stream, what the production line is going to be that generates that thing. We haven't connected all of the bits of value together. So see here, I'm going to talk a little bit about the weird value stream. Where does it come from? Well, it's often opaque. It might be the idea of somebody senior. It might be a regulatory requirement that somebody has unearthed and they desperately quickly need to get something in place for a regulatory requirement. On some projects that I've worked on, it's been a promise that has been made by a minister in a speech several years ago that somehow now people have realized that nothing has been done to back up that promise and something needs to be done very quickly. Who supports it? So very often it's not clear what the support for this idea is. Why is there money that's appearing for this particular idea? Why not for other ideas? And also often, now I seem like I'm being very rude about this, but I'm not being rude about ideas. I'm just trying to be clear that there are kind of aspects of these ideas, the ideas phase, which is extremely peculiar. And one of the things that you often find with an idea is that there is something wrapping around it, which is a kind of, I've put here sprinkling of fairy dust. There's some kind of language surrounding the idea that makes it, that simplifies it, that makes it attractive, that kind of discourages any kind of real analysis of the idea or kind of argument with it. And that's often things like, this will do everything that the old system did, but better, or this will kind of use a new technology. And in itself, the fact that it's using this new technology is by implication that it's going to make things much, much more simple. I think we're going to hear a lot about projects like this in the near future that have got AI in them. So there is some kind of language surrounding this idea that discourages further thought. And part of the reason the thing got funded was because of that, because it has this kind of this promise, this kind of sparkly sprinkling of fairy dust around it. What about the value stream that doesn't exist? Well, the value stream that doesn't exist, it needs work. It needs actual effort of lots of different kinds, probably. If you imagine, if you don't have production line and you want to put a production line in place, that's not just one kind of thing. That's not just one kind of effort. That's lots and lots of different kinds of effort. It requires connection to the users. It requires connection to the pull that is potentially there for like delivering value to the users. It requires understanding who the users are, what the users want, and also like kind of how all of these bits of value stick together, to what degree they need to perform, to what degree is an acceptable cost for these bits of, so like if you think about this with a car, how good does the paint have to be that goes on the doors on a car? What's an acceptable cost for it? What's an acceptable speed for putting that piece of for painting a door and then attaching it to a car? All of those things have been ironed out with cars over 90 years. For a brand new product, all of these things need to be understood. So kind of when we're starting to put together the production line, the value stream for a new product, we have to start to put together all these things. Unfortunately, there's a further complication. Putting together those bits of the production line that we need to put together to actually have any chance of delivering this thing that's described in the dream tends to undermine the dream. Why does it tend to undermine the dream? Well, once you start to do things, you start to get an idea of how much effort it might be to really do things, to finish things. Once you start to make any kind of progress, you start to get an idea about how long it might take to make complete progress. on the previous slide, I said, like, if you're going to actually build that value stream, then you need to connect to pull, you need to connect to users. When you start to connect to users, maybe the users aren't interested in what you've been talking about. Maybe they want something different. Maybe the users point out that what you're asking for is contradictory. When you start to build things, you will unearth contradictions in what has been talked about in the idea, which might not have been a problem when it was just talk. Once you actually try and connect things together, you will unearth contradictions. Technological challenges. Maybe the new magical technology doesn't work in exactly the way that you thought it was going to work. When you actually try and connect bits together to deliver value, maybe that is much more difficult than you thought it was. And then there are all sorts of other aspects of having a brand new prototype value stream rather than an existing mature value stream, which will be frustrating. And all of this starts to take the shine off of the original idea. Now, there are some solutions. There are ways through this. There are ways around this. And all of these ways involve kind of starting to build that value stream that we know we need to have. So one of those is connecting to pull. So connecting to users, understanding what users actually want, understanding what they don't want, understanding really what the detail is of how this thing needs to perform, which is probably not outlined in the idea. Building, starting to connect some parts of the value stream. So every part of the value stream that you start to connect with another one gives you more understanding of how the whole thing might work. And as much as possible, tackling these technological and logistical aspects of the value stream without attacking, not so much the idea, but without attacking the people who had the idea. So the people who had the idea, the people who got the idea funded, the people who attached their name to the idea, they are in some ways in a very vulnerable position when it starts to be obvious that there are problems with the idea, that it costs way more than was initially talked about, that there are technological issues, that it's difficult to put things together and generate the kind of value that they originally talked about. And then another crucial part of this solution is to leave room when you actually do start to make progress and do start to assemble bits of the value stream, to give credit to the people who initially had the idea. So this is basically a crucial part of the solution, is to find users who actually want to be consumers of this value stream that you're trying to construct. And one of the crucial reasons for this is that once you've actually connected with those users and you are providing those users with some kind of value, the dynamic of the project completely changes, because this project then moves from being a project that is being pushed by the energy generated by the ideas value stream to something that is being pulled by the pull generated by the new value stream that's being created and the users that are at the end of it. And so that's why wherever possible, you should start to try and dig and connect and make these aspects of the value stream work. And this is something that I'll talk about in a lot more detail in another section of the book, where I talk about kind of escape, which is the whole business of getting software out from inside an organization and connecting to users. But this is often something that is another kind of tension between the original idea and the business of generating a real value stream, is that in order to do that, bits of it have to be constructed. And that those bits in themselves might not seem that valuable. But the important thing is that all of those things, basically, the more of those small bits you can connect together, and especially then connect to users outside of the organization or outside of the project, the more chances you have of this project being successful. And then the final thing that I've just been talking about there is make sure that the people who were initially involved have an opportunity to take credit. So this may be people who at various stages through the project have either distanced themselves from it, or because of the conflict between the idea and the realization of the idea, have put obstacles in the way of kind of, for example, insisted that the project can't be broken down into smaller bits and certain bits of it delivered because the whole thing has to be delivered at once, or have tried to obstruct access to potential users because they sense that kind of if they actually have, if you have access to users, then the users will have a different idea about what the product wants, what the product needs to do, etc. So the crucial thing that I'm trying to explain here is that in a project for a new kind of product, rather than an existing kind of product like a car, there will always be inherent tension between the idea and the process that has come to fund and support that idea, and the value stream that needs to be created and manufactured in order to deliver that idea and connect it to its pull, to its users. And that tension, that space between the idea and the to-be built value stream is the space that project managers inhabit. And this is the really important thing that I haven't created the slide specifically to talk about this, but this is the really important thing. And this is the value of talking about these ideas, because you start to realize the structure. That this space is in many ways, it's an uncomfortable space. And what you're doing when you're trying to get better at being a project manager is you're getting better at being comfortable in this uncomfortable space. So there are ways of being comfortable in this uncomfortable space that won't work. What you're doing is essentially you're managing a contradiction. You're managing the conflict between the idea and the reality. So what do I mean about ways of being in this space that won't work? So one of the ways of being in this space that won't work is refusing to challenge aspects of the idea that are fundamentally broken from a technological point of view, or from a cost point of view, from a resources point of view, or from a point of view of that they don't make sense. Like, so there are aspects of the idea that just fundamentally contradict each other. If you don't, if you kind of think, oh, well, for a quiet life, I'm just not going to resist those, I'm not going to test them, I'm not going to challenge them, then the product there will never be a product, because in order to actually build that production line that is needed at the end, you need to challenge these things about cost and technology and the logic of what goes on. If you don't challenge attempts to stop you and your team talking to potential users, this will result in the project being a failure, because what we know we need is we need to kind of get to that point. We need to get to the point where we have pull from genuine users. We have genuine people who will find this thing valuable and want to use it. And the other thing is that, so those are kind of ways of, like, essentially not fighting the fight. But I think there are some other, so, you know, kind of like ways that you can exist badly in that contradictory space are by not fighting the fight, by not making it clear what the contradictions are, by not making it clear what the difficulties are. But there are other ways of existing in that space which are also wrong, which I think maybe sometimes I've been guilty of, which is there are ways of making it abundantly clear that from what you're finding as you start to try and build what you're finding as you start to build the production line, the value stream that you need for the real thing, that this is a dumb idea, that this is somehow catastrophic, and that, you know, basically there are ways of being overly threatening towards the people who initially got the idea, or overly threatening towards the notion of the project. And this is kind of like, in a way, this is kind of a symbol of kind of like, I don't know, weakness, lack of maturity, fear, that kind of, you when you hear the way that the project is initially being phrased, which has got that kind of magical, shiny language around it, and then you look at the reality of what's actually going to happen, there's a kind of temptation at that point to completely slam the brakes on everything and say, look, this is never going to happen. The things that are described in the kind of unicorn description of the project, none of those things are going to happen. And that is also a bad way of existing in that space. It's the kind of way of existing in that space that gets often called negative. And the result of being too negative in that space is that you tend to get shut up or ignored. And that won't work either. That won't result in the kinds of things needing to happen that need to happen in order to make this project a success. So what you're really trying to do when you're inhabiting this awkward space is get more comfortable at being in this awkward space, maintain as much awareness as you can of what the difficulties are, of what the likelihood is of success, but also kind of maintain pressure to connect to potential users so that you have a chance of modifying what the project does in light of what value it can give to users. You have a chance of discovering new value by actually connecting things together. So that is really this is really my take on what project management is about. And it's been a long time me coming to this kind of understanding, is that project management is about inhabiting this contradictory space in a way that is neither too destructive to the idea nor too destructive to the things that need to be done in order to realize that idea in the real world. Okay, I'm going to stop there, I think. I don't know how I can stop the video from recording. There we go.